I'm going to start today with a little story about something that's just happened. Counsellor, who's a client of mine, came onto my Zoom call earlier and said to me, "Wow," she said, "is that your office? Is that your room?" So I said, "Yes, it is." She says, "Oh, it's so neat and tidy." And I said, "If only you knew. I've got the camera facing out this way, but if it was facing down here, you'd see this huge mess." That's on the side of my desk. And I've got loads of post-it notes all stuck to the wall. It's really messy, so much so that I'm thinking about changing where I work so that we can actually entertain people in our dining room without them having to see my mess. But isn't it funny how, I project this view of being so tidy and organised, but the reality is very different. And yet I love to project this beautiful background that I've got, but it doesn't actually show the reality, but it saves me from being judged. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, the sense of fear of being judged, because we don't really want people to see the real us because we're not quite sure that it's good enough. So today, what we're going to be talking about is imposter syndrome, particularly in relation to when you're writing your marketing, such as your directory profile or your posts. And I wonder if this scenario resonates with you, that you spend a good while writing something and then you don't actually publish it. Or possibly you might not even get as far as that. You go on to, say, counselling directory because you want to write your profile. You're not quite sure what to say. So you look at what everyone else says and then you think, oh no, I'm not as good as that. I can't do this. And it really puts you off actually writing your profile. And I've certainly worked with people where we seem to have spent an awful lot of time where they've been writing their profile and yet nothing really changes. And I think that's quite often because of imposter syndrome, because they're, so worried that if they put what they say out into the world, they're going to be picked up for being a fraud, that perhaps they can't really live up to whatever it is they're saying. And so they hold back from saying it. And it's such a shame, because the fact is you are really well qualified. You have spent time with clients. You have spent time studying this. You may well have lived experience that you're bringing into the mix as well. You really are a really, really good person to be out there sharing who you are. But we shy away from it because we're so frightened that we'll be found out that in actual fact we're a fraud, that we're an imposter. And that's what imposter syndrome is, isn't it? Imposter syndrome is that sense that we don't belong, that we're a fraud, and that everybody else belongs, but we don't. And we're really scared of being found out, of being judged. And so that really affects us. I wonder if any of this is resonating with you. Do you think that you're an imposter? Do you feel like, oh, if I write something, it might show me up? Is there anything in particular that you've struggled to write? For example, when I run my Make Your Profile workshop, one of the things that I do is I ask people, as one of the sections, is to write about their previous experience and tell us something around what do you bring to the table? What do you bring that's your experience, that's unique? And people find it so very, very difficult to write it. And even when they have got bags of experience, they really worry about saying it. And people tell me that that's the hardest task that I actually get them to do, is to talk about why they think they're suited to working with a particular type of client. But the funny thing is that everybody else can see it so clearly. And because we work in a group when we do the Make Your Profile work, other people will be saying to somebody, "Oh, that sounds amazing. You've just got such great experience." And they're like, "Oh, do you think so?" Because it's so hard. We're so hard on ourselves, aren't we? We're our own hardest critics. And therefore, we think everybody else isn't an imposter, but we really are. And it's so hard for us to change that view of ourselves. But I just want to read out something that I found really helpful. So when there's been research studies into who feels like an imposter, initially it started, they thought it was a woman's problem, but actually, as research has gone on over time, what it's been discovered is that about 70% of people feel like they're an imposter. So if you feel like you're an imposter, you're really not alone. I know it feels like you are, but you're really not alone. And this is what Amy Cuddy says, who wrote a book all about this. If only we all knew how many of us felt like imposters, we'd have to conclude either we're all imposters and none of us know what we're doing, which maybe isn't really true, is it? Because we do see a few people who seem to know what they're doing. Or number two, our self-assessments are way off. And that's the point. I think our self-assessments are way off. In actual fact, we're not a fraud. We're not an imposter. It's just that we feel like we are. So the question is what can we do about it? And just to say at this point that last week's podcast, the November social media toolkit, I talk about this in relation to your posts, your social media posts, and give you some tips. And then this week's podcast, which is coming out on Thursday, it's along the lines of, do you feel like a fraud when you're writing your directory profile? So I look at imposter syndrome and how it impacts your directory profile in more detail, plus come up with some practical tips as to what you can do about it. So for a bit more information, do listen to the Good Enough Counsellors podcast, both episode 33 and episode 32. But briefly, what I suggest you do is think about the people you want to help. Who's helping them at the moment? And you know what? I think sometimes if you look at what people say and you look at the misinformation that's out there on social media, it can make you quite angry. And I would harness that anger and use it to power you, use it as fuel for you to get yourself out there and start telling people actually what you do know. Because as I said earlier, you have got a tremendous amount of training, knowledge, and experience. You've got a lifetime of your own experience. And the fact is that no one can actually argue with your experience because your experience is your experience. This is what I find. And particularly if you're doing something on social media, holding on to that can be really helpful. This is the way I see it because of my experience. No one can argue with your unique story. And then finally, just in finishing, I just want to remind you that if you're in a community, that fear of judgment, it thrives on shame, and shame thrives on secrecy. But when you're in a community and when people are being vulnerable and honest, that changes the game completely, because suddenly you find you're not alone. And I had this in my live feed challenge a week or so ago when someone shared a video and then afterwards she said, you know what, she said, I feel awful this morning. I sort of keep looking at myself, wondering if I've done it wrong. She was worrying about how she came across, what she sounded like, what she looked like, and just was a complete idiot doing that. And I called it, I said it's what Brené Brown calls a vulnerability hangover. But the fact is because she was vulnerable, because she shared that's how she was feeling, it then enabled other people to say, you know what, I feel like that too. And it opened up lovely, lovely support from each other. And this is what we do in my Make Your Profile workshop. Being in a community, sharing with other people, being vulnerable helps you to know that actually you're not alone in your imposter syndrome. This is something that so many of us feel. And a little plug for my Make Your Profile workshop. I'm doing a live training on the 16th of October, and the implementation program is actually happening the 21st to the 25th of October. So if you'd like to be a part of that, please do have a look at that link. Join me for a month in therapy growth group and we'll get that profile written and that imposter syndrome beaten. Okay, thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.